So in today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about oligopoly, which is our third market structure in this unit. And for this one, there's a few key characteristics that we're going to kind of familiarize ourselves with. The first is that oligopolies have a small number of firms, and we're going to say anything from probably 2 to 8 or so is pretty oligopolistic in terms of if you have a firm, maybe let me clarify, if you have 2 to 8 firms that represent most of the market. We also usually associate it with significant barriers to entry and exit. And we'd say that there's market power, so they are price makers. Just like a monopoly, they are price makers. So these firms are not just taking a market price. We'll zoom out just a little bit for you there. So these firms are what we call price makers. They can set a market price to some extent. Another key characteristic, and this is really, really important, is called interdependence. And that means that the profit, or really in general, the decisions that firms make, right? The decisions that a firm make is going to really depend on the decisions of the other firms, and the outcomes that they get are going to be interdependent. So an example of that might be if one firm decides to advertise, then another firm, that might influence another firm's decision to advertise. So they're interdependent. They have a relationship with each other. Now, we have actually a couple of ways of calculating how much market power we're really dealing with here. The first is called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, and I've actually made a mistake here that I'm going to correct in a second, and it's a common legal measure of concentration. So this is actually used by the FTC, and the Department of Justice antitrust divisions, and that's how they decide to approve or disapprove mergers. What they do is they square all the firm's market shares and then sum the squares. So this is incorrect, this information. So I'm going to draw a line through that, and we're going to say those are wrong, right? Wrong. If the 4 firms are 30%, 30%, 30%, and 20%, so let's say you have 4 firms, and those are their ratios. Well, you have 30 squared plus 30 squared plus 30 squared plus 20 squared. Now, if you're not a math whiz like I am, right, like I'm not, I should say, I'm not a math whiz. I knew in advance that I was going to do this, but it's 900, because that's 30 squared, and 900, and 900. And then you have, 400, right? So for all of those, and then you just add them up, and it's fairly straightforward to say this is here 900 times 3 is 9 times 3 is 27 plus 4 is 3100. 3100. Now we have kind of 3 levels of interpretations here that you can see, and we basically say, hey, if it's below 1500. It's not really an oligopoly anymore. It's not really an oligopoly. And so this one is 3100. That's pretty highly concentrated. So if it's between these two, we'd say it's moderately. And these standards are actually set by the FTC and the Antitrust Division. And what they say is, hey, if you're in, let's say, this category, the moderately concentrated category, we're not going to approve a merger that would push the HHI above 2500. Unless you can really prove to us that there's some things that you're going to change in that market. So another way to think about it is, what would be the highest HHI possible? Well, if you could imagine, the highest would be one firm, right? Just one. And that one firm would have 100% of the market ratio. So 100% market ratio, 100% squared is 10,000. So that would be the very highest HHI possible. What would it be if you had 2 firms, a duopoly, and this is kind of what's nice about this, if you had 2 firms, each with 50 and 50, okay? That would be 50 squared plus 50 squared. Well, that's 2,500 plus 2,500 is 5,000, right? So imagine if you had 5,000 with a 50-50. Now, here's why the HHI is so powerful, right? Here's why it's such a powerful thing. Imagine instead if you had a 99% for one firm and a 1% for the other. It's still a duopoly, right? It's still 2 firms, but 99 squared, 9801. 9801 plus, what's 1 squared? Well, that's 1, so it's 9802. So 9802 versus 5,000. Those are two very different values, and it's because, hey, in the 99% one, you're basically a monopoly. If you're over 9,000, you're already pretty close to a monopoly. But if you're 5,000, that's way more competitive than 9,800. Now, is it still highly concentrated? Absolutely. But it allows us to see some nuances, right? Imagine if you had one firm in a 4-firm ratio. If you had a 4-firm ratio of 97 and then 1 and 1 and 1, well, if you sum up their squares of all of those, then you'd get a really, really highly concentrated ratio, right? You could do that. Now, the second measure of market power is less robust. All this one is just called as the 4-firm concentration ratio. And this is basically you just add up the market shares of the 4 largest firms. And we could say that, hey, if the 4 biggest firms in the market have 100%, right? In this case, if we would say the 4-firm ratio is 100%, well, then above 90 is highly concentrated. But in many markets, you have, maybe 50 firms. And if in the 50 firms, the top 4 of them have 40% of the market, right? Well, then that means it's not really that oligopolistic. But if the top 4 firms had 85% of the market and then the other 46 had 15% of the market, that's pretty oligopolistic. So this is another legal measure that we can use to determine it. But notice that we can't tell the difference between, something where you have 2 firms where they both have 100% of the market share. You can really kind of get some nuanced, nitty-gritty, granular detail with an HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So the kinds of things you're going to be asked is, how do we interpret this? You'll be asked things like, hey, you have a firm, you have a market, that is to say, with an HHI of 9,000. And then you have another one that's 5,000. Which one is more concentrated? And so you'll be asked to interpret numbers. It's highly unlikely you're going to be asked to calculate numbers like this, but I just am kind of giving you some examples. Okay. Now, here's an interesting thing that we do start to see with oligopolies. So these are the ways we measure them. These are their key characteristics. Here's things that we start to observe. That firms in oligopolies will actually try to avoid competition. They try to avoid competing with each other. They don't want to get in each other's ways. And there are 3 ways that they do that. One is they form cartels. These are sometimes called trusts. And most American laws prevent their formation. An interesting fact is that for a long time, trusts and cartels were not really illegal outside of the United States, but the U.S. really cracked down on them. So most U.S. trade laws say, hey, you can't have a formal cartel. This would allow them to behave like a monopoly. And we're going to do a simulation, a cartel simulation in class, that will show that what they're trying to do is set a price where they derive some monopoly power. Now, they are inherently, it'd be nice if I could spell, inherently unstable. And we'll find out why in class a little bit more, actually. We'll do a practice problem. The second way that they'll avoid competition is through informal collusion. And that would be something that allows us to study, the mathematical branch that allows us to study is called game theory. We're going to return to that. But basically they have kind of strategies where, hey, we don't have to sit down and talk with each other, but we can end up doing what's best for all of us by engaging in kind of certain behaviors that we'll examine in a few minutes. Product differentiation is another way that they try to avoid competition. They'll basically try to get you to become a brand loyalist, or they'll engage in other things called non-price competition, like warranties and amenities and things like that. One thing to think about is that if they make high switching costs, that's another example. So what does that mean? That is the idea that it's hard to switch from one product to another. So this could actually be an avoiding competition thing. So you can imagine, right, Mr. Glossiger has this lovely cell phone, and it's an Android, right? G7 ThinQ LG Android phone. So that phone, right, in the Android system, it's hard to switch from an Android to an Apple phone because the operating system is different. You've already got all these apps, you know how to use it and things like that. So if companies can make it hard to switch from one thing to another, that can actually encourage brand loyalty as well. So hopefully this helps you understand some of the basics about oligopolies, and I'll see you next time.